This week we are going to discuss World War I, which was also known as the war to end all wars. So here's a picture of what the alliances looked like before World War I. The countries that have a purple background were part of the Triple Entente, which was Russia, France, and Britain. The countries that have a green background were known as the Triple Alliance, which was Italy, Germany, Austria-Hungary. And then the orange background was the Balkans, which consisted of Bulgaria and Serbia. So where you see the countries overlap, that shows their relationship with each other. So the countries where you see where the overlap is yellow, that means those countries offered aid to one another. The countries where the overlap is green means that they had a treaty, and where it's blue, those countries had some type of alliance. So why did World War I happen? Wilhelm II rose to the throne of Germany in 1808. So after he rose to the throne, he began to try to build up Germany's strength, and that included building a navy and planting colonies around the globe. So here we start to see some German imperialism. In 1892, so shortly after he rose to power, other countries such as leaders of Russia and France were starting to worry about what Germany was doing, and this prompted a defensive alliance to counter the threat of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. So England would side with Russia and France and form the Triple Entente. So this is where we see those alliances start to form, the Triple Entente and the Triple Alliance. So the Ottoman Empire. So Turkish lands on its southern borders appealed to the strategic goals of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And by 1914, the Austro-Hungarian Empire had control of Bosnia and Herzegovina and viewed Serbia, which was a nation that was protected by Russia, as its next challenge. So they're kind of starting to spread, trying to take control of other countries, and so they look to Serbia as their next country that they want to conquer. On June 28, 1914, a Serbian assassinated the Austro-Hungarian heirs to the throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and his wife, Grand Duchess Sophie. Okay, so here's a picture of Franz Ferdinand and his wife, Sophie. Okay, so they were assassinated, which sparked World War I. Okay, so here you see the different alliances because it truly was a world war. So the countries that are green sided with the Allies, the countries that are orange sided with the Central Powers, and all of the countries that are gray were neutral. Okay. So that kind of sparked countries starting to declare war on everyone. So Austria issues a list of 10 ultimatums to Serbia. In those ultimatums, it says that the Serbian government would have to accept an Austro-Hungarian inquiry to the assassination. Serbia was to suppress all anti-Austrian propaganda and to take steps to root out and eliminate terrorist organizations within its borders. So Serbia doesn't agree to the term, so Austria declares war on Serbia. As a result, because Serbia was protected by Russia, Russia mobilizes its forces to protect Serbia, and Germany then declares war on Russia to protect Austria. So at this point, we just see everyone just starts declaring war on everyone else. Okay, so how does this war spread through Europe? So Germany planned to take advantage of sluggish Russian mobilization by focusing the German army on France. So Germany's first goal is to try to mobilize its army onto France. So the German military leaders, they used tactics developed earlier and activated the Schlieffen Plan, which moved German armies rapidly by rail to march through Belgium and into France. Because they couldn't go directly into France, they were going to go through Belgium into France. So the violation of Belgian neutrality also ensured that Great Britain entered the war against Germany. Okay, so Belgium at this point was neutral, and because Germany decided to invade France and go through Belgium to do that, that kind of voided Belgian neutrality and showed that Germany didn't respect that. So on August 4th, 1914, Great Britain declared war on Germany for failing to respect Belgium as a neutral nation. Okay, so here's an example or what the plan looked like that Germany used. So we see that the red lines show where from Germany they were going into France. So we see that, yeah, they extensively went into Belgium in order to get to France. And then the yellow shows you that Belgium was a neutral nation. Okay, so shortly after, Germany introduces U-boats.
Germany announces an exclusion zone of unrestricted submarine warfare, a campaign to attack all enemy ships, military and civilian, without warning. Its goal, to cut off all British commerce and vital war supplies.
A lot of the things that Britain needs to survive, it has to bring in. And it brings it in by ships, largely from the United States, from South America, along well-traveled and long-established shipping lanes. Britain doesn't get what it needs from those ships. The British are going to starve. And so the Germans could cut them off from the outside world with submarines. They could force the British to leave the war.
Until now, U-boats tried to play by international rules of engagement for all naval vessels and give civilian crews the chance to surrender and abandon ship before sinking it.
Well, you can see the obvious problems with that. When a submarine surfaced, it's vulnerable, and the British very quickly learned to arm their merchant ships. Submarines would surface, and the merchant ship would start shooting at them.
It couldn't stop a ship, take the passengers off, put them in a place of safety on board the submarine. There just wasn't space. You might capture the captain, but there wasn't space for all the crew and passengers. So submarines had to be used in a very inhumane way.
The new rules of engagement get fast results. By the end of April 1915, German U-boats sink 39 merchant ships, using both torpedoes and their powerful deck guns. But the new tactic of shoot on sight means American ships and citizens are soon caught in the crossfire.
The problem with unrestricted submarine warfare for the Germans was that you couldn't tell necessarily who you were sinking.
Okay. So here we see the sinking of the Lusitania. So Lusitania was a British ocean liner, and it was traveling from New York to Liverpool, England. So this is where we see an example of unrestricted submarine warfare. They were warned by the German embassy that Americans traveling on British or Allied ships did so at their own risk. So while this was a British ocean liner, there were Americans on board, and they were warned beforehand that there was a possibility that the ship would be hit by one of these U-boats. So this ship was carrying about 173 tons of war munitions for Britons, which the Germans cited as justification for the attack. So this was before the U.S. got involved in World War I. So as a result of this ship being hit by a U-boat, being hit by one of their torpedoes, more than 1,100 people died, including 120 Americans. Okay, so what did the war look like in America? So this was the 1916 election results. So we have Wilson versus Hughes. The main issue going on at this point was World War I neutrality, because America was neutral. They had not been involved. They had not been dragged into the war yet. So the reason, this was a re-election campaign for Wilson, and one of the slogans for his campaign was "He kept us out of war." So we see that that's why some Americans voted for him, was because he kept them out of war for the first 2 years of the war, and they were hoping that he would keep them out of the war until the war ended. Okay, but it was a pretty close election. Okay. So here's a picture of President Woodrow Wilson and his wife, Edith Galt. Okay. So his wife was born in 1872, and this was actually his second marriage. They were both each other's second marriage. They had both been married one time before. So she was 16 years younger than Wilson. And what's important about Edith is that in 1919, Woodrow Wilson would suffer a stroke towards the end of his second term in office. And as a result, his wife, Edith, she was the one who took care of him, and she was really the only one who would go in and see him and make sure he was okay. And she would bring him all of his important documents that he needed, and they would come out signed by him. So people were concerned because they felt like the documents were actually signed by her, and that they weren't sure how much Woodrow Wilson was participating or how much work he was able to get done because of the stroke. So Edith is sometimes considered, or she is considered like one of the first women, or the first woman who has ever run the country, because all of these important documents were going through her first before they got to Woodrow Wilson. And she was also adding notes, adding points that she thought Woodrow Wilson should include in these important documents. So the First Lady was very instrumental towards the end of Woodrow Wilson's second term as president. Okay, so why did America get involved in World War I? So America enters the war because of the Zimmerman telegram. So Great Britain, at this point, they were losing. They wanted America to get involved. They were hoping that the sinking of the Lusitania and the loss of American lives would help them and stir American nationality and hopefully get America involved in the war. But that wasn't enough. So now we have the Zimmerman telegram. So the Zimmerman telegram was sent by Arthur Zimmerman, and this was a secret diplomatic communication issued from the German Foreign Office in January 1917. So this telegram proposed a military alliance between Germany and Mexico if the United States entered the war against Germany. If Mexico agreed to side with Germany, if the United States entered the war, then Mexico would recover Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico, which they had previously owned in the early 1800s. Okay, so after we get involved in the war, America has to start recruiting people. So these are some of the recruitment posters that they had in order to encourage people to join the war effort. Okay, so since America gets involved in the war, they start the Selective Service Act.
The Selective Service Act of 1917 was the first mass draft of Americans. There had been conscription in various forms before, but even in the Civil War, only 8% of Union troops came from conscription. Whereas selective service made every American man between the ages of 18 and 45 liable to registration. Not all of them were drafted, of course. About 3 million were. That's a significant number. And this represented a big presence for the federal government in Americans' everyday lives, as they went to register for the draft, as they carried their draft cards, which were the first identity documents that most Americans had ever carried. Many of them had physical exams or IQ exams. The American population was being measured and counted and accounted for in new ways. The Selective Service Act was also not the most popular act in American history. That although Wilson's declaration of war passed with overwhelming support, the Selective Service Act passed very narrowly. And in fact, Woodrow Wilson had to turn to Republicans across the aisle to get the act passed at all. That some of the most bitter opponents of it were some of his former Democratic allies. And on the ground, the Selective Service Act wasn't always popular either. Estimates are that perhaps as many as 300,000 Americans simply dodged the draft by not registering for it or not showing up when the calls came. And there was some opposition to it. There were not the big public demonstrations that we might imagine from where we sit today, but there were sort of individual acts of resistance, some protests along the way.
Okay, so we have the Selective Service Act, which is essentially just a draft so we could have more troops in the Army fighting in World War I. Okay, so that also led to rationing. Since we were having troops in the war, we had to ration our food to make sure that there was enough food going towards the war effort. So here are two posters that they had, which was encouraging people to use less so that way they could send more to the troops that were overseas. So they had things like meatless Mondays, wheatless Wednesdays in order to encourage people to use less food just in their everyday lives. Making sure that Americans aren't over-consuming. Okay, so then we have the Espionage and Sedition Acts. So the Espionage Act of 1917 prohibited obtaining information, recording pictures, or copying descriptions of any information relating to the national defense with intent or reason to believe that the information may be used for the injury of the United States or to the advantage of any foreign nation. So essentially, this goes hand in hand, essentially spying. They weren't allowed to release any information that could possibly harm the United States and that would help out another country. So they weren't allowed to get information from the United States and say, give it to Germany, who we were at war with. Then there is the Sedition Act, which came out a year later. This was added as an amendment to the Espionage Act, and it severely curtailed or limited people's free speech the free speech of U.S. citizens during time of war. Okay, because you were not allowed to speak negatively about America's involvement in the war. Here are a couple of posters about the Espionage and Sedition Acts. Okay, so these were used to, once again, encourage people to not run their mouths, not talk about U.S. plans with someone who might possibly be a spy. So here we have Eugene Debs, and he was pretty popular during this time period. He ran for 5 times for the presidency under the Socialist Party of America, and he was arrested for protesting America's involvement in World War I. So in 1918, he was sentenced to 10 years in prison just because he did not agree with U.S. involvement in World War I. But his sentence was commuted. So there were people who were asking Woodrow Wilson, who was president at the time, to commute his sentence, to pardon him, but Woodrow Wilson refused to. So when Harding was president in 1921, he commuted Debs' sentence. And part of the reason why Wilson refused to pardon or commute his sentence was because he felt like Debs was a traitor to his country. Okay, so he would spend about 3 years in prison before his sentence was commuted. Okay, so what did women's roles in the war effort look like? So here we have Loretta Perfectus Walsh. So she's pretty interesting because she was the first woman to serve in any of the U.S. Armed Forces and other than a nursing assignment. Because previous to this, women more or less, they just basically served as nurses. Okay, so she was the first woman to enlist in the U.S. Navy specifically. Okay, then we have Hello Girls. Hello Girls were essentially just American telephone switchboard operators, so they just answer telephones. Okay, so here we see them more at work abroad in the Salvation Army. So it was really cool. They had this program where they would give donuts to U.S. soldiers. So that's what we see here. Them making donuts, making desserts, giving them out to the U.S. soldiers. Okay, so the YMCA also contributed to the war effort. Here we have two women, Addie Hunton and Katherine M. Johnson, and they were really important because at this time, U.S. troops were still segregated. So they were able to work with segregated African American troops in France and be there and support them and help them in their fight against Germany and help defend France during World War I. Okay, so what happened before the armistice? So European powers struggled to adapt to the brutality of modern war. The rapid addition of American naval escorts to the British surface fleet and the establishment of a convoy system countered much of the effect of German submarines. So before America got involved, Germany was doing pretty well. But that kind of stopped when Americans started to support Great Britain. They started sending more supplies, troops, things like that. So just the physical presence of the American army proved a fatal blow to German war plans. So in 1917, the Russian army collapsed and exited the war, which freed Germany to fight the war on one front. Because at that time, they were trying to fight a lot of different people. So this actually helped Germany out by Russia dropping out of the war. Okay, but at the same time that Russia dropped out of the war, the United States got involved. Okay, so here we see the Kaiserschlacht, which was the spring offensive. Okay, so the spring offensive was a series of German attacks along the Western Front during the First World War. So this began on March 21st, 1918, and it ended July 18th, 1918. Okay, so this is just essentially what the Germans were planning to do and how they were planning to attack.
Johnny, get your gun, get your gun, get your gun. Take it on the run, on the run, on the run. Hear them calling you and me, every son of liberty. Hurry right away, no delay, go today. Make your daddy glad to have had such a lad. Tell your sweetheart not to pine, to be proud her boys in line. Over there, there, that the Yanks are coming, the Yanks are coming, the drums rum-tumming everywhere. So prepare, say a prayer, send the word to beware. We'll be over, we're coming over, and we won't come back till it's over, over there, over there, over there. Send the word over there, that the Yanks are coming, the Yanks are coming, the drums rum-tumming everywhere. So prepare, say a prayer, send the word to beware. We'll be over, we're coming over, and we won't come back till it's over, over there. Johnny, get your gun, get your gun, get your gun. Johnny, show the Hun you're a son of a gun. Hoist the flag and let her fly. Yankee Doodle do or die. Pack your little kit, show your grit, do your bit. Yankees to the ranks from the towns and the tanks. Make your mother proud of you and the old red, white, and blue. Over there, send the word over there, that the Yanks are coming, the Yanks are coming, the drums rum-tumming everywhere. So prepare, say a prayer, send the word to beware. We'll be over, we're coming over, and we won't come back till it's over, over there, over there, over there. Send the word over there, that the Yanks are coming, the Yanks are coming, the drums rum-tumming everywhere. So prepare, say a prayer, send the word to beware. We'll be over, we're coming over, and we won't come back till it's over, over there.
So armistice just means a truce that is agreed upon between both sides to stop fighting. So Armistice Day was November 11th, 1918, and now it's known as Veterans Day. Okay. So Treaty of Versailles. So this is where they get together to decide what the end of the war should look like. So they put pretty much all of the blame on Germany. So they told Germany that they had to hand over their territories and colonies, which we saw at the beginning in 1888, that they were building up their strength. They were starting to take control of more territories, more colonies, but now they had to hand all of those over. They placed limits on their weapons and what equipment they were allowed to have. They had trials to examine what war crimes were committed and to punish those who had committed war crimes. And then they were told that they had to pay $33 billion in reparations. So reparations is just money that is used to try to fix the damage that has been done, or to make amends for something that, or to make amends for a wrong that someone has done. And so they said that they had to pay $33 billion to repair some of the damage from World War I. Okay, so with the Treaty of Versailles, we have Wilson's 14 points.
The 14 points. On January 8th, 1918, President Woodrow Wilson delivered his famous 14-point speech, where he outlined a plan to end World War I and secure world peace. When the war broke out in 1914, Wilson adopted a policy of neutrality with no intention of involving the U.S. in a foreign war. But the U.S. couldn't remain isolated for long. In January 1917, British intelligence intercepted and decoded a message known as the Zimmermann telegram, in which Germany asked Mexico to ally with them against the United States. Then, on February 1st of the same year, Germany announced unrestricted submarine warfare and started sinking merchant and passenger ships with U.S. citizens on board, something they had agreed not to do after sinking the Lusitania in 1915. The Lusitania, a British ocean liner, was torpedoed without warning, leading to the deaths of over 1,100 people, including 128 Americans. This was the final straw. On April 2nd, 1917, President Woodrow Wilson went before a joint session of Congress to request a declaration of war against Germany. Just 2 days later, on April 4th, Congress declared war. The war was brutal and expensive. In a little under 2 years of fighting, the U.S. had spent $32 billion and lost over 116,000 men. Wilson wanted the war to end, but when announcing his 14 points in January of 1918, Wilson didn't just want to end the war to protect America, he hoped to prevent wars from ever happening again. So together with his advisor and friend, Colonel Edward M. House, President Wilson organized a group of 150 political and social scientists to study Allied and American policy all over the globe, collecting nearly 2,000 reports and 1,200 maps. This would inform the idealistic 14 points, which would address causes of the World War and also propose solutions to ensure world peace in the future through policy and negotiations. 8 of the 14 points were aimed at resolving specific territorial issues among the countries involved in combat and securing borders and statehood for Italy, the Turkish part of the Ottoman Empire, Poland, and Austria-Hungary. 5 points covered general principles for a peaceful world: open treaties and agreements, freedom of the seas, free trade, reduction of armaments, and adjustment of colonial claims to land. These were all based on the principles of self-determination, the idea that nations should have the right to govern themselves without interference from other countries. The 14th and most influential point proposed that countries form an alliance to guarantee the political independence and territorial integrity of great and small states alike. The 14-point speech reflected a tradition of diplomatic idealism that would come to define Wilson's presidency. But how did that idealism translate into action? Well, most of Wilson's points were never fully realized. But one point in particular would have a big impact on the Treaty of Versailles and the end of World War I. When the Allies met in Versailles to create a treaty to end the war, they were less interested in Wilson's idealistic vision and more interested in regaining what they had lost and punishing Germany. To Wilson's disappointment, the points were barely integrated and only to the benefit of the Allies. Most of them weren't actually adopted or honored by anyone after the treaty was signed. However, the 14th point was incorporated: the creation of a world organization providing collective security. This would later be known as the League of Nations. Ironically, despite a campaign from Wilson, the U.S. never actually joined the League of Nations. Wilson foreshadowed that without American membership in the League, there would be another world war within a generation. Sure enough, World War II would break out just 20 years later.
Okay, so what is the aftermath of World War I? So the Russian Revolution occurred in 1917, which led to an increased fear of communism. So we'll see this a lot with the Red Scare in America, how much we started to fear communism. And we see that a lot with the Cold War, which we would get involved with shortly after World War II would end. So white Americans desired a return to the status quo, a world that did not include social, political, or economic equality for Black people. And we kind of see that with the 1920s, how they were looking for what they termed a return to normalcy. And we also have the Red Summer of 1919. So the Red Summer was a series of racial riots which took place in more than 36 cities across the United States. So we start to see a lot of racial tensions as we go into the 1920s. So women's involvement in the war helped lead to the passage of the 19th Amendment, which granted women the right to vote. Rationing of material for clothes during the war meant that clothing styles would change for women as well as men. So in the 1920s, the popular image that we tend to have of women is of flappers with their shorter dresses, with less clothes than they normally had been wearing up until that point. And part of the reason for that is because they had to ration material. So they started coming out with new styles of clothes. The use of modern warfare would spur the development of new technology like refrigerators, washing machines, and televisions. So in the 1920s, we really start to become a culture of consumption, and because there's a lot more things that are being mass produced and a lot more options for Americans to buy. Okay, so that is the end of this lecture, and next week we will discuss the 1920s.